Putin's response to G7 will shock you, and here's why. With the G7 introducing a price cap on oil exports out of Russia, we have entered uncharted territories. It is now anyone's guess what could happen in the international market, as Russia is now put in a tight spot with the EU completely deciding to ban the oil import from Russia, and also its decision to maintain the price cap of $60 for any and all export of oil from Russia. Why has a price cap been introduced to the oil export out of Russia? How has the Russian president responded to the price cap introduction? Grab your helmets as we drill through this video to get to the bottom of it. Both the EU and the West have made several sanctions and prohibition against Russia, which limits a lot of the freedom that it used to enjoy before the attack on Ukraine in February. While the sanctions have definitely made a difference, the West has struggled to curtail Russia's main source of revenue, which is hydrocarbon exports. Russia's gas exports have fallen in the last few months, largely because of the decision of Europe to cut off exports into the European markets. Yet still the numbers of oil revenue generated by Russia are still running higher than they were in 2021. Nonetheless, after months of contemplation between the G7 and the EU, they have finally devised a plan to reduce Russia's oil revenues. This is the introduction of the new $60 price cap, which came into effect in December. Why is sanctioning hydrocarbons, and especially oil, so difficult? When the war began, many people in the West started to effectively sanction Russia's hydrocarbon exports and stop buying Russian oil and gas. Doing so is significant, as oil and gas account for about half of Russia's exports and about 40% of the state revenue. Before the war, Europe accounted for a majority of all purchases. So the basic idea was that if Europe stopped buying Russian hydrocarbons, the Kremlin would lose a substantial fraction of their revenues. Unfortunately for Ukraine, though, this didn't happen. Not just because there is a high need for Russian hydrocarbons and gas, but also because that's just not how global energy markets function. If Europe stops buying oil from Russia, that just introduces an inefficiency into the global oil markets, which in turn pushes up the global oil prices, meaning that if Russia does find another buyer for the oil, then the higher prices can compensate for any shortfall in sales. Something similar happened with gas earlier last year when Russia reduced flows via Nord Stream 1. It brought the total flow to Europe down by nearly 40% as a result of this move. European gas prices subsequently jumped about 60%, meaning that Gazprom actually made more money despite reduced flows. The next conclusion that the EU and the West had reached was to ensure that even if global prices go up, Russia doesn't benefit from the elevated prices. This seemed more plausible, as most of Russian gas is exported via pipelines, so if you shut them off, then Russia would have to completely build a new pipeline somewhere else, like China, or invest in liquefied natural gas infrastructure, which costs time and money. However, this is substantially harder to do with oil, because oil is mostly exported via tankers, so even if you could ban European tankers from shipping Russian oil, they can easily be replaced by international ones. And even if it was possible to completely cut Russia off from the global energy markets, it is still the world's second hydrocarbon exporter, so the absence would significantly reduce the global supply, pushing up the prices. This would lead to making life in rich countries more expensive and bring about existential threat to poorer countries. This price cap essentially limits the price at which Russia can sell its hydrocarbons, yet guaranteeing Russian oil companies a slight profit, but prevents them from taking in massive revenues. On an average, it costs Russian oil companies around $40 for the extraction of a barrel's worth of oil. So ideally, the price cap should be just above $40, giving the Russian oil companies incentive to continue production, but at the same time limiting the profits earned. In the end, the EU had decided on a price cap of $60, which is actually pretty high given the cost of Russian oil extraction and the fact that Russian oil is currently selling at about that level. Some European countries were wary of setting the price cap too low, as they feared retaliation from the Russian side. The price cap is one that doesn't apply to either the G7 or the EU countries, as they all have committed to the complete ban on Russian oil imports. The price cap instead applies to all third world countries like China who are currently buying Russian oil in the international markets. Now at this point, you're probably wondering how the G7 and EU could enforce a cap on a trade between Russia and China. Even though neither of them is in either grouping, but essentially the idea is that the EU and G7 countries can ban from either shipping oil or choose not to provide shipping insurance for the export unless they abide by the price cap set. This essentially means that European ships, which usually account for the majority of Russian oil shipping, aren't allowed to continue shipping unless they abide by the price cap. Even if non-European ships sail in to replace them, they would not be allowed to get insurance from American or European companies. This might not sound too bad, since the ships could get insurance from some Russian or Chinese company, but that's really not an option simply because shipping insurance is really costly. Shipping insurance needs to cover everything from small crashes to oil spills, which cost billions to clean up. Unfortunately for Russia, the only companies with pockets deep enough to provide this sort of insurance are American and European. So basically, the G7 and the EU can exert influence in the cap oil prices by refusing to offer insurance to any third-party ship that isn't abiding by the set price cap. So will this work? Well, that completely depends on how the various parties react. It remains to be seen whether third world countries like China and India, who tried to avoid participating in Western sanctions in the past, would actually abide by a set price cap. Even if they don't, just the existence of the price caps would bring down Russian oil prices because countries like India and China can use it to leverage cheaper prices out of Russia. So it ultimately depends on how Russia reacts. So how did the Russian President Vladimir Putin react to the price caps set by the EU? Russian President Vladimir Putin has threatened to cut oil production in response to the G7's price cap on Moscow's crude exports, a measure Western countries hope will keep oil flowing while denting revenues for the Kremlin's war in Ukraine. Putin has signed a decree to ban the sale of oil to any customer countries who insist on capping the price set by the EU. This ban will come into power the first week of February 2023. Allowing Russian producers to change trading agreements and even use it to sidestep their contractual terms for export. This new decree gives a Fuel and Energy Commission new duties aimed at securing compliance in accordance with the decree. The commission is currently chaired by the country's Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak and consists of representatives of Russian key ministries. The decree implies that the ban on the price caps set by the EU would be applicable throughout all phases of the delivery up until it reaches the buyer. This ban is also described as temporary rather than a permanent measure, as it is scheduled to expire on 1st of July next year, according to the decree. Mikhail Krudikai, a partner in Moscow-based energy consultancy RusEnergy, described Putin's decree as impossible to implement. Numerous reports based on monitoring of tanker arrivals and departures in Russian hub export ports of Novorossiysk, Primorsk, Ust-Luga, and Murmansk suggested a 50% decline in the country's oil shipments to international markets just in the first half of December, compared with November. Novak said that authorities expect Russia's total output to decline between 7% and 8% in 2023 compared to 2022, averaging between 9.8 million BPD and 10 million BPD next year. It is yet to be seen, even after the unveiling of the decree by Putin, how everything would come about. Whether or not going against the price caps set by the EU and the West will work out for Russia, or will everything eventually collapse in a massive chaos? Like and subscribe and comment to make sure you're right on top of all the international paramount rights as they happen.